I checked my equipment one more time before loading the last of my gear into Deep Current's cabin. Everything had to be perfect for this trip. Not just because I was sailing solo through some of the most talked about waters in the Atlantic, but because I planned to document every single mile of it. My mission was simple: sail straight through the heart of the Bermuda Triangle, record normal weather and sea conditions the whole way, and finally put this ridiculous myth to rest with hard data. The reinforced fiberglass hull gleamed under Newport's morning sun as I secured my backup GPS unit next to the primary navigation system. I'd brought 3 different radio systems, 2 emergency beacons, and enough survival gear to stock a small Coast Guard station. Overkill maybe, but I wanted zero excuses when people tried to explain away my successful transit. "Carol, hold up a minute." I looked up to see Phoenix Bowers walking down the dock toward me, his Harbor Authority uniform crisp despite the early hour. The man had been watching me prep for the last 2 days with the kind of expression you'd wear to a funeral. "Phoenix, I'm burning daylight here. What's up?" He stopped at my stern line, hands on his hips. "I've been checking the marine forecasts again. There's some weird pressure systems building out there, and the satellite imagery shows cloud formations that don't match any of the prediction models." I tied off my last dock line and straightened up. "Weird how?" "Circular patterns forming about 200 miles southeast of here. The meteorologists are calling it an anomaly, but 3 different weather services are showing completely different forecasts for the same area." Phoenix pulled out his tablet and showed me a mess of colored lines and symbols. "Look at this. NOAA says clear skies. Weather Underground is predicting severe thunderstorms. And the European model shows something that looks like a tropical depression." I glanced at the screen and shrugged. Computer models disagree all the time. That's why I brought multiple weather radios and enough supplies for 2 weeks instead of 5 days. "Carol, I'm serious. Maybe wait a few days until this sorts itself out." The concern in his voice was genuine, but I'd heard the same thing from every harbor master, sailing instructor, and weekend warrior who'd learned about my route. Everyone had a reason why I shouldn't go, and none of them were based on actual data. "Phoenix, I appreciate the worry, but I've been planning this trip for 8 months. I've got perfect weather windows, calm seas, and every piece of safety equipment known to man. What exactly are you afraid of?" Before he could answer, heavy footsteps echoed down the dock behind us. Martin Campbell approached with his usual military bearing, wearing pressed khakis and a Navy veteran's cap despite being retired for 15 years. "Morning, Carol. Phoenix." Martin nodded to both of us, then fixed me with those sharp blue eyes. "Heard you're heading out to the Triangle today." "That's right. Should be a nice, boring sail with absolutely nothing mysterious happening." Martin's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "You know, I commanded destroyers through those waters for 20 years. Lost radio contact more times than I care to count, even with military-grade communications equipment." I finished coiling my dock lines and looked up at him. "Equipment failures happen everywhere, Martin. Salt water and electronics don't play nice together. Sure, equipment fails, but not all at once, and not in patterns." He leaned against a dock post, settling in for one of his stories. 1987, we were running exercises about 300 miles southeast of here. Beautiful clear day, calm seas, perfect visibility. Suddenly every radio on the ship went dead for 47 minutes. Not static, not interference. Complete silence. Our radar showed contacts that appeared and disappeared without any logical movement patterns. "Solar flare activity can cause widespread electromagnetic interference," I said. "It's well documented." "No solar activity that day. We checked." Martin's voice carried the authority of someone who'd filed official reports about the incident. When our communications came back online, we were 12 miles off our plotted course with no record of course changes in the ship's log. Phoenix shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Martin, you're not helping. I'm trying to keep a good sailor from making a mistake." Martin looked directly at me. "Carol, you're smart and you're experienced, but the ocean doesn't care about your equipment or your expertise. Some areas demand respect whether you believe in them or not." I felt my jaw tighten. This was exactly the kind of superstitious nonsense I was sailing out to disprove. "Martin, with all due respect, unexplained doesn't mean supernatural. It means you didn't have the right instruments or enough data to figure out what really happened. Maybe, or maybe some things can't be explained by instruments." I pulled my route chart from the cabin and spread it across my cockpit table. The red line I'd drawn cut straight through the triangle's center, passing through coordinates where dozens of ships and planes had supposedly vanished, without a trace. "Look at this route. I'll be in constant GPS contact, checking in with Coast Guard radio every 6 hours, and documenting weather conditions continuously. When I reach Nassau in 5 days with a logbook full of perfectly normal sailing conditions, maybe people will finally stop treating this area like some kind of supernatural danger zone." Phoenix studied my chart, tracing the route with his finger. "You're going right through the deepest part of the Sargasso Sea. Water's over 3 miles deep out there. So if something does go wrong, you're a long way from help." I folded the chart and tucked it back into my navigation station. "That's why I've got redundant safety systems and enough emergency supplies to survive for weeks. Plus, this is 2024, not 1945. Satellite tracking means the Coast Guard knows exactly where I am every minute." Martin and Phoenix exchanged a look that irritated me more than their warnings. They were treating me like some weekend sailor who didn't understand the risks, instead of a marine engineer with 15 years of blue water experience. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the concern, but I'm burning my weather window standing here talking." I started my engine and let it warm up while checking my instrument panel. Every system showed green. "Phoenix, I'll radio you when I clear the continental shelf. Martin, I'll send you a postcard from Nassau." Martin stepped back from my boat but didn't move away from the dock. "Carol, if you run into anything out there that your instruments can't explain, don't try to figure it out. Just get clear and worry about understanding it later. The only thing I'm going to run into is normal weather and regular ocean conditions." I cast off my bow line and moved to the stern. "Which is exactly what I'm going to document for everyone who thinks this area is special." Phoenix caught my stern line as I released it. "At least promise me you'll check in every 6 hours like you said. If we don't hear from you on schedule, I'm calling the Coast Guard immediately." "Deal. But you're going to get very bored listening to routine position reports." I backed deep current away from the dock and turned toward the harbor entrance. Behind me, Martin and Phoenix stood watching like they expected to never see me again. The dramatic send-off would have been funny if it wasn't so typical of the irrational fear this area generated in otherwise sensible people. My GPS showed a perfect satellite lock as I cleared the harbor breakwater. The morning sun had burned off most of the coastal fog, revealing moderate swells and light winds from the southwest. Ideal conditions for the first day of my passage. I raised my mainsail and jib, feeling deep current respond to the wind with the smooth acceleration that made sailing addictive. I opened my logbook and made the first entry. Wait for 7 hours. Departed Newport Harbor under sail. Wind SW 12 knots, seas 2 to 3 feet, visibility 8 miles. All systems normal, GPS tracking active, course 135 degrees magnetic toward Triangle Center. The radio crackled as I switched to the Coast Guard frequency. "Coast Guard Portsmouth, this is sailing vessel Deep Current. WDB 4429, departing Newport for Nassau. Estimated passage time 5 days. Checking in every 6 hours on this frequency. Deep current. Coast Guard Portsmouth. Roger your departure. Have a safe passage and fair winds. I smiled as I signed off. In 5 days, I'd have enough documented evidence to write the definitive debunking of Bermuda Triangle mythology. The ocean stretched ahead of me, blue and ordinary and completely explainable. My wake spread behind deep current in a perfect V as we sailed east into the morning sun. Just another day on the water, heading toward just another patch of ocean that happened to have a ridiculous reputation. I couldn't wait to prove how wrong everyone was. 2 days out from Newport, I was starting to think I'd picked the wrong week to prove the triangle was boring. My compass had been acting weird since yesterday afternoon. The needle kept drifting counterclockwise no matter how many times I tapped the housing or adjusted the mounting. I'd switched to my backup compass that morning, only to watch it do the exact same thing. Both instruments showed me heading southeast when my GPS clearly indicated I was on course. Magnetic interference, I muttered, making another correction to my heading. Had to be something simple like that. The GPS wasn't helping my confidence either. Every 20 minutes or so, the signal would weaken, and I'd lose satellite lock completely. The screen would show, searching for satellites, for 3 or 4 minutes, before suddenly reconnecting with perfect reception. I'd never seen anything like it, but GPS glitches happened all the time near military installations or during solar weather. What really bothered me was the wind, or rather, the complete lack of it. I'd been motoring for 6 hours, straight through the flattest calm I'd ever seen. My sails hung like wet laundry, not even a breath of air to fill them. The ocean stretched away in every direction like a sheet of dark glass, so smooth it looked artificial. No swells, no chop, no movement at all except for my own wake, spreading behind deep current. I killed the engine and let the boat drift while I checked my weather radio. 3 different marine forecasts had predicted 15-knot southwesterly winds for this area, but I couldn't feel so much as a whisper of breeze. Coast Guard Portsmouth. This is sailing vessel Deep Current. WDB 4429. Position report. Static filled my headset, punctuated by low-frequency pulses that came in regular intervals, almost like a heartbeat if heartbeats lasted 3 seconds each. I tried again on a different frequency, same static, same rhythmic pulses underneath. Well, that's new. I opened my logbook and started writing. Day 2, 1430 hours, multiple equipment anomalies. Both compasses showing magnetic deviation, GPS signal intermittent, radio receiving interference on all frequencies. Wind completely absent despite forecasts. Possible explanations: solar flare activity, military exercises in area, underwater geological features affecting magnetic fields. The rational explanations felt good to write down. Everything had a cause, even if I couldn't identify it immediately. I spent the next hour trying to recalibrate my instruments using my backup electronics kit. The GPS kept cycling between perfect reception and complete signal loss. The radio produced nothing but static and those weird pulses. Even my depth sounder was acting up, showing the bottom at 3,200 feet 1 minute and no reading the next. By evening, I'd given up on the electronics and broken out my sextant to shoot star positions the old-fashioned way. At least celestial navigation didn't depend on satellites or magnetic fields. Except my sextant readings didn't match my GPS position either. I double-checked my calculations, verified the time, and shot 3 different stars. According to the math, I was 15 miles northeast of where my GPS said I was. Either my navigation skills had gotten rusty, or something was seriously wrong with my position data. I dropped anchor and sat in my cockpit as darkness settled over the motionless ocean. The silence was incredible. No wind in the rigging, no waves against the hull, No sound except my own breathing and the occasional creak of the boat settling on its anchor line. That's when I heard it. A deep, resonant groan rose from somewhere far beneath my hull. It started low, almost below the range of hearing, then built to a sound I could feel in my chest. The tone held steady for what felt like 30 seconds before slowly fading back into silence. I grabbed my depth sounder and checked the reading. 3,847 feet. Way too deep for whale songs to carry that clearly to the surface. Whales could dive deep, but their vocalizations didn't usually penetrate that much water with such clarity. I waited, listening hard. The ocean stayed silent around me, so still I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Probably a whale, I said out loud, just to break the quiet. Humpbacks can be heard for miles underwater. But I'd heard whale songs before, and this was different. Lower, more sustained, and somehow more deliberate, like it was meant to carry a specific distance. I made another log entry. 2,145 hours, heard unidentified sound from deep water. Duration approximately 30 seconds, very low frequency. Depth 3,147 feet. Likely whale vocalization, though unusually clear for this depth. The scientific language made me feel better. Everything could be explained if you had enough data and the right instruments. Solar activity could mess with electronics. Underwater geology could create magnetic anomalies. Marine life could produce sounds that seemed strange if you weren't familiar with their behavior patterns. I heated up a can of soup on my camp stove and tried the radio again while I ate. Still nothing but static and those rhythmic pulses. I'd have to wait until morning to try reaching the Coast Guard for my scheduled check-in. The ocean remained perfectly calm as I finished dinner and prepared for sleep. No wind, no waves, no sound except the gentle creaking of my rigging. It was like being anchored in the middle of a lake instead of the Atlantic Ocean. I was just closing my logbook when the groaning sound came again, longer this time and somehow deeper. It seemed to rise from directly beneath my keel, vibrating through the hull and into my bones. I checked my depth sounder again, still showing nearly 4,000 feet of water below me. Just whales, I told myself, settling into my bunk. Big ocean, lots of marine life, nothing mysterious about it. But as I lay there listening to the absolute silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something down there in all that dark water was listening back. I jerked awake to the sound of every piece of electronics on my boat having a complete meltdown. My GPS was beeping frantically while the screen flashed between my position and random coordinates scattered across the Atlantic. The radar display looked like a Christmas tree gone wrong, contacts appearing and disappearing in patterns that made zero sense. Something the size of an aircraft carrier showed up 300 feet below my keel, held steady for 10 seconds, then vanished completely. What the hell? I stumbled out of my bunk and started checking systems. The depth sounder cycled between 4,200 feet and no bottom found every few seconds. My wind instrument spun wildly despite the dead calm outside. Even my simple LED cabin lights flickered in rhythm with the electronic chaos. I powered down the main electrical panel and waited 30 seconds before bringing everything back online. The radar immediately lit up again with impossible contacts, massive objects moving in formation beneath the surface, some showing as solid returns bigger than city blocks. My marine radio crackled to life with fragments of voices speaking what sounded like Portuguese, then German, then something I couldn't identify at all. Underneath the voices, mechanical pulses beat in perfect synchronization, like a dozen sonar systems pinging in harmony. Coast Guard Portsmouth. Coast Guard Portsmouth. This is sailing vessel Deep Current requesting radio check. Static answered me, punctuated by those rhythmic pulses that seemed to be getting stronger. I tried the emergency frequency. Same static, same pulses, and now what sounded like whale song mixed with machinery. The combination made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't explain. The ocean around me stayed flat as a mirror, but something was moving down there. I could feel it through the hull, currents that shouldn't exist in this calm, pressure waves that rocked my boat without any visible source. My anchor line went slack, then tight, then slack again as if something massive was passing underneath. I grabbed my emergency kit and checked my flares. 6 aerial signals, 4 handheld smokes, and 2 parachute rockets. Plenty to signal for help if I could figure out who to signal. The groaning sound started again, but louder now and coming from multiple directions. Deep, resonant calls that seemed to answer each other across miles of dark water. I'd heard whale songs before, but this was different, more complex, more organized. My handheld GPS showed the same position as my main unit when it wasn't glitching. 32°15 north, 64°40 west, dead center of the Bermuda Triangle, exactly where I'd planned to be. I lowered my water temperature probe and watched the digital readout climb to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. According to my charts, surface temperature should be 72 degrees maximum for this area in October. The water was warming up, and I had no idea why. The electronic chaos reached a peak around 11:45 p.m. Every screen on my boat flashed in unison while the radio produced a sound like a dozen different languages being spoken at once, all overlaid with mechanical pulses that beat like a massive heart. Then, at exactly midnight, everything stopped. The screens went dark. The radio fell silent. Even the groaning sounds from the depths cut off like someone had thrown a switch. I sat in my cockpit, surrounded by absolute silence, staring at dead instruments and trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Solar flare activity, military exercises, underwater volcanic activity affecting magnetic fields and water temperature. But deep down, in a part of my brain I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew I was experiencing something that wouldn't fit in any official report. The ocean stretched away in every direction, black and still and waiting. I checked my life raft deployment handle and made sure my emergency beacon was within easy reach, though I couldn't say exactly what I was preparing for. Something told me I was about to find out. I woke to the feeling of my ears trying to turn inside out. Pop, pop, pop. Like I was driving down a mountain road, except I was floating on 4,000 feet of ocean with nothing but flat water in every direction. I sat up in my bunk and immediately felt it again, a sharp pressure change that made me swallow hard to clear my ears. My barometer told the story. 24 hours ago it had read 30-15 inches and holding steady. Now the needle pointed to 29.23 and dropping fast. I watched it fall another 1/100th of an inch while I stared at the dial. That's not possible. I stuck my head out of the companionway and looked around. The horizon that had been clear and empty when I went to sleep now showed a dark line to the northwest, like someone had drawn it with a black marker across the sky. As I watched, the line grew taller and wider, building into towering thunderheads that climbed toward space. The storm was moving toward me with unnatural speed. I'd seen fast-moving squalls before, but this thing covered the distance from horizon to overhead in maybe 20 minutes. The sun disappeared behind walls of black cloud, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in the time it took me to pull on my foul weather gear. The ocean surface started going crazy. Waves appeared from nowhere, steep and sharp-crested, coming at me from 3 different directions at once. My boat pitched and rolled as confused seas built around me, water sloshing against the hull in patterns that made no sense. I fired up the engine and raised anchor as fast as I could. The storm center looked massive, and I needed to get clear before the real wind hit. But when I pushed the throttle forward, the engine coughed twice and died. Come on, not now. I checked the fuel gauge. 3/4 full. Oil pressure normal. Temperature normal. I hit the starter and got nothing but a grinding sound that meant the engine wasn't even trying to turn over. The wind picked up to maybe 20 knots, then 30, then started howling. I unfurled my storm jib and tried to sail clear of the approaching system, but the wind kept shifting direction every few minutes. One moment I had a steady breeze from the north. The next it was blowing hard from the southeast, then swinging back to the west. The waves built to 15 feet, then 20, then sizes that made my stomach drop when I looked up at them. Steep walls of dark water with foam streaming off their tops, moving in crossing patterns that created pyramid-shaped peaks and deep holes between them. I clipped my safety harness to the jacklines and fought to keep deep current pointed into the worst of the seas. The boat climbed each wave face like it was going up a hill, paused at the crest with the bow hanging in space, then slammed down into the trough with a crash that shook every piece of gear on board. The barometer kept falling. 29, 10, 28.95, 28.80. Lightning started hitting the water around me. Not distant flashes, but close strikes that lit up the whole ocean and left the smell of ozone burning in my nose. The hair on my arms stood up from static electricity, and I could feel the charge building in the air before each bolt. Rain came down in sheets so thick I couldn't see past my bow. Horizontal rain driven by winds that had to be pushing 60 knots, maybe more. I huddled in my cockpit and tried to keep the boat from getting rolled by the confused seas. That's when I saw it. A shadow beneath the waves, maybe 50 feet down, keeping pace with my boat. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, storm clouds and lightning playing games with my eyes, but the shadow stayed there, moving with purpose through water that should have been too rough for anything to navigate. It was huge, easily twice the length of deep current, maybe longer. I caught glimpses of it between waves, a dark mass that moved too smoothly to be debris and too deliberately to be a whale. The shadow surfaced just enough to create a wake, not the V-shaped wake of a boat or the rolling disturbance of a whale, but something else. A broad, powerful surge that pushed water aside in patterns I'd never seen before. I wiped rain from my eyes and stared down into the churning water. The shadow was still there, still keeping pace, still moving like it knew exactly where I was going. A 40-foot wave picked up deep current and threw us sideways into a trough. I fought the tiller to bring the bow back around, and when I looked down again, the shadow had moved closer. 30 feet down now. Close enough that I could make out details that made my hands shake on the wheel. It wasn't a whale. The creature's head broke the surface like a nightmare rising from the depths. I'd seen whales before. I'd seen giant squids in documentaries. This was something else entirely. A mass of wet, scarred flesh that stretched beyond the reach of my deck lights into the storm darkness. 8 tentacles, each one thicker than my mast, pushed through the churning water with movements too coordinated to be random. 2 eyes the size of dinner plates fixed on my boat. Amber-colored, glowing with their own light, and unmistakably intelligent. They tracked my movement as I scrambled for the emergency flare gun, watching me with the focused attention of a predator that had found exactly what it was hunting. The thing had to be over 100 feet long, maybe more. Its mottled gray-green skin showed deep scars and ridges that spoke of age and battles I couldn't imagine. When it moved, the water displacement created waves that rocked deep current like a cork. I fired the flare directly at its face. The phosphorus charge exploded in a burst of red light and chemical smoke. The creature let out a sound that combined a steam whistle with a roar, jerking backward and diving beneath the surface. For maybe 10 seconds, I thought I'd scared it off. Then the ocean beneath my keel erupted. The kraken came up directly under my boat, lifting the entire 36-foot vessel 10 feet into the air on its back. I felt the hull flex and crack from the pressure as deep current balanced on top of something that shouldn't exist. My compass spun wildly. My depth sounder showed 0 feet, then error, then started beeping frantically. I grabbed the emergency axe from its bracket as tentacles thick as telephone poles wrapped around my mast. The rigging screamed under the pressure, steel cables snapping like guitar strings, wooden spreaders exploding into splinters. My mainsail tore in half as one appendage coiled around the boom and twisted it into scrap metal. The creature's grip tightened. I could hear my hull groaning as the fiberglass started to give way. I swung the axe at the nearest tentacle with everything I had. The blade bit deep into flesh that felt like wet rubber over steel cable, and thick, dark fluid spurted across my deck. The smell hit me immediately. Salt and copper and something organic that made my stomach turn. The kraken's response was immediate and personal. Those amber eyes swiveled toward me with what I could only call anger, and suddenly I wasn't dealing with a mindless sea monster anymore. This thing was thinking, planning, and it was very, very pissed off. It threw my boat sideways into a wave trough like a kid tossing a toy. I hit the cockpit, combing hard enough to see stars, then scrambled for a handhold as deep current rolled nearly to her beam ends. Water poured over the rail and into the cabin through the open companionway. 2 massive tentacles wrapped around my hull from opposite sides and began to squeeze. The fiberglass cracked with sounds like gunshots. My portside windows exploded inward, sending glass and seawater cascading into the cabin. The creature was methodically crushing my boat, while other tentacles probed for ways inside, sliding across the deck with horrible wet slapping sounds. I grabbed another flare and fired it point blank at the nearest eye. The creature flinched and loosened its grip just enough for me to dive below and grab my emergency kit. Smoke canisters, signal rockets, and a handheld VHF radio that was probably useless but might buy me time. When I came back on deck, a tentacle the size of a tree trunk was exploring my cockpit, its tip moving with delicate precision as it investigated my steering wheel and instrument panel. The thing was learning about my boat, figuring out how it worked. I pulled the pin on a smoke canister and jammed it directly against the searching appendage. Red chemical smoke billowed everywhere, and the tentacle jerked back like it had been burned. The creature's grip on my hull loosened slightly. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The storm was calming around us. The waves were settling into regular patterns. The wind was dropping to a steady 15 knots. The kraken was controlling the weather, and now it had me exactly where it wanted me. I fired every flare I had left, one after another, straight into those massive amber eyes. The phosphorus charges exploded like miniature suns against the creature's face, and it let out a sound that made my teeth ache. Part steam whistle, part dying wail, all rage. The kraken jerked backward and loosened its grip on deep current. I had maybe 10 seconds before it came back madder than before. I slammed the engine controls to manual override and hit the starter. The diesel turned over once, caught, and roared to life. I shoved the throttle forward, but the boat lurched sideways instead of ahead. Something had wrapped around my propeller shaft, a tentacle thick as my waist, coiled tight around the drive system. The engine screamed as the prop tried to turn against the creature's grip. Metal shrieked. The entire drive assembly twisted sideways with a crack that I felt through the hull. And then the motor died completely. Water was pouring in through 3 different hull breaches now. I could hear it sloshing in the cabin below, and deep current was getting heavier by the second, sitting lower in the water with each wave. The kraken came back with a vengeance. This time it didn't bother being careful. Massive arms swept across my deck, ripping away everything that wasn't bolted down. My radar antenna snapped off like a twig. The boom twisted into scrap metal. One tentacle wrapped around my mast and pulled until the entire rig came down in a crash of splintering wood and screaming cables. I grabbed a smoke canister from my emergency kit and pulled the pin. Red chemical smoke billowed out in a thick cloud, and I hurled the whole thing directly at the nearest eye. The creature flinched back from the smoke like it had been slapped. Its tentacles waved frantically, trying to clear the red haze, and for a moment its grip on my boat loosened. I used those seconds to deploy my life raft. The CO2 cartridge fired with a bang, and the yellow raft started inflating on my foredeck. But before it could fully expand, a tentacle the size of a telephone pole punched straight through the center, leaving me with a deflated piece of rubber and broken dreams. My boat was sinking. The creature was between me and any escape route, and I was running out of things to throw at it. That's when I remembered the emergency fuel reserves. I yanked open the cockpit locker and pulled out the 5-gallon jerry can I kept for long passages. Gasoline sloshed inside, enough to get me to port if my main tank ran dry, but right now it was something else entirely. I unscrewed the cap and started splashing fuel across my deck. The smell hit me immediately, sharp and chemical in the salt air. Gasoline ran along the cockpit sole and soaked into the teak planking, creating a slick that reflected the storm lightning. The kraken's tentacles were probing my rigging again, sliding across the deck with wet, slapping sounds. One appendage brushed through the fuel slick, and I saw my chance. I grabbed my last marine flare, a handheld red signal that burned at 2,000 degrees, and struck the igniter. The deck exploded into flame. Fire raced across the gasoline in a whoosh that singed my eyebrows and lit up the entire ocean. The creature's tentacle that had been exploring my cockpit was suddenly wrapped in burning fuel, and the kraken's shriek this time was pure pain. It jerked backwards so fast that my boat rocked violently. All 8 arms pulled away from deep current as flames spread up my mast and caught my shredded sails. The fire climbed higher, fed by gasoline and canvas and 50 years of marine varnish. The heat was incredible. I could feel it baking my face even from the far end of the cockpit. But the kraken was retreating, those intelligent eyes reflecting the flames as it sank back into the dark water. My boat was burning and sinking at the same time now. The hull breaches were letting in water faster than my bilge pump could handle, and the fire was spreading to everything flammable on deck. I had maybe 2 minutes before deep current went down completely. I grabbed my emergency beacon from its bracket and checked the activation light. Green LED, transmitting strong. If this thing worked in the triangle's interference zone, someone might actually find me. The kraken was still out there, circling just beyond the reach of the flames. Waiting. Deep current tilted hard to port as water flooded the cabin. The fire was eating through my rigging, sending sparks and burning debris into the storm-tossed waves. I could see a gap between 2 of the creature's massive arms, maybe 20 feet of open water. It was the only chance I was going to get. I clipped the beacon to my life vest, took 3 deep breaths, and dove overboard. The water was shockingly cold after the heat of the fire. I surfaced, gasping, and started swimming as hard as I could away from both the burning wreckage and the monster. Salt water filled my mouth. Waves slapped my face. But I kept stroking, putting distance between myself and those amber eyes. Behind me, deep current's mast collapsed in a shower of sparks. The kraken moved toward the sinking boat, but the combination of fire and chemical smoke from my flares seemed to keep it cautious. It probed the burning wreckage with one tentacle, then pulled back as flames licked at its flesh. I swam until my arms felt like lead and my lungs burned from the effort. When I finally stopped and looked back, my boat was just a distant glow on the dark water. The creature was a shadow among shadows, and I couldn't tell if it was following me or not. The storm was calming around me. The waves were settling into regular swells, and I was alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with nothing but a life vest and an emergency beacon that might or might not work. But I was alive, The kraken had let me go. The water felt like ice after the heat of the burning boat. I surfaced gasping, salt stinging my eyes, and watched Deep Current's mast collapse in a shower of sparks that hissed when they hit the waves. The kraken had pulled back from the flames, those massive amber eyes reflecting the fire as my boat tilted hard to port and started going down fast. I treaded water and fumbled for my emergency beacon with numb fingers. The plastic case was slippery, but I managed to activate it and check the LED display. Red light. No satellite connection. The damn triangle interference was blocking the signal, just like it had killed my radio. The storm was dying around me. The waves that had been trying to kill me an hour ago were settling into regular swells, and the wind dropped to maybe 10 knots. It was like someone had turned off a switch, or something had decided it was done playing with me. Deep Current's bow went under with a sound like a sigh. 36 feet of fiberglass and dreams disappearing into water that was probably 3 miles deep. I watched until the last glow from the burning rigging winked out, leaving me alone in the dark Atlantic with nothing but a life vest and whatever was in my pockets. I did a quick inventory by feel. Emergency beacon that wasn't working. Signal mirror clipped to my vest. 3 energy bars in waterproof packaging. A small bottle of fresh water, maybe 12 ounces. Waterproof matches in a plastic case. Not exactly a survival kit, but better than nothing. The kraken was gone. I couldn't see those eyes anymore, couldn't feel that massive presence moving beneath me. Maybe the fire had scared it off, or maybe it just got bored once my boat was destroyed. Either way, I was still breathing, which was more than I'd expected 10 minutes ago. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky gray and then pale yellow. In daylight, I could see debris scattered across maybe 100 yards of ocean. Seat cushions, pieces of sail, chunks of fiberglass that used to be my cockpit. I started swimming toward the biggest pieces, my life vest keeping me afloat but making every stroke awkward. The first cushion I reached was one of my cockpit seats, still mostly intact. I grabbed it and looked around for more floating pieces. A section of my boom, part of my cabin sole, some rope that had somehow stayed coiled. If I could tie enough stuff together, maybe I could build something that would keep me out of the water. It took me 2 hours to collect everything within swimming distance and lash it together with the rope. What I ended up with barely deserved to be called a raft. 3 cushions, 2 pieces of decking, and some sail canvas held together with half hitches and prayer. But when I climbed on top, it held my weight and kept most of me above the swells. The sun was getting higher, and I could already feel it starting to work on my face and arms. I rigged a piece of canvas as a lean-to, creating maybe 2 feet of shade over part of my raft. It wasn't much, but it was better than cooking in the open. I checked my beacon again. Still red. Still no satellite connection. The water around me was that deep blue color that meant serious depth. No land in sight. No other boats. No aircraft. Just ocean stretching to the horizon in every direction. I was somewhere in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle with a raft that might fall apart in the next big wave. I allowed myself 1 small sip of water. The bottle felt impossibly light in my hands. By noon, the sun was brutal. Even with my makeshift shade, the reflection off the water was cooking me from below while the direct rays worked on everything the canvas didn't cover. My lips were already cracking, and I could feel my skin starting to burn despite the sunscreen I'd put on yesterday morning. Yesterday morning, when I still had a boat and thought I was just dealing with some weird weather. I tried not to think about the kraken. Every shadow beneath my raft made my heart race. Every piece of floating debris looked like a tentacle until I got close enough to see what it really was. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that giant sea monsters didn't exist, that I'd hallucinated the whole thing due to stress and equipment failure. But the rest of me remembered those intelligent eyes and the way the creature had systematically destroyed my boat. Another sip of water. Maybe a quarter of the bottle left. I pulled out my signal mirror and started flashing it at the sky, sweeping back and forth across the horizon. The reflected sunlight was bright enough to be seen for miles, assuming anyone was looking. But the shipping lanes were probably 50 miles away, and aircraft wouldn't be searching for me until I missed my next radio check-in, which I'd already missed by about 6 hours. The afternoon dragged on. I dozed fitfully in my patch of shade, waking every few minutes to check that my raft was still holding together and scan the horizon for rescue. The rope was stretching, and one of the cushions was starting to lose air. I retied the knots as tight as I could, but the whole thing felt like it might come apart at any moment. Around 4 o'clock, I thought I saw something in the distance, a dark speck against the sky that might have been an aircraft. I grabbed my signal mirror and started flashing like crazy, sweeping the light back and forth across where I thought the plane was heading. The speck disappeared. Either it had been too far away to see my signal, or it had never been there at all. I was starting to understand how people went crazy at sea. As the sun got lower, I rationed myself another tiny sip of water and one of my energy bars. The food helped, but it made me thirstier. I had maybe 6 ounces of water left, and no idea how long I'd be out here. The beacon was still transmitting its useless signal into the interference zone. I thought about turning it off to save battery, but what if the triangle's electronics problems were temporary? What if rescue aircraft were already looking for me just outside the range where my signal could get through? I kept it running. Sunset painted the sky orange and red, and then darkness settled over the ocean like a blanket. The temperature dropped fast, and I pulled the canvas around me like a sleeping bag. My raft rose and fell with the swells, and I could hear water sloshing between the cushions where my improvised lashings weren't quite tight enough. That's when I heard the groaning again. Deep, resonant calls rising from somewhere far below. The same sounds I'd heard before the kraken attacked, but closer now. Much closer. My raft shuddered as something large moved beneath it, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I lay perfectly still and tried not to breathe too loud. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to attract its attention. I'd gotten lucky once when the fire scared off the kraken. I probably wouldn't get lucky twice. Something bumped my raft from underneath. Gentle, almost curious, like a cat investigating a new toy. The cushions shifted and I had to grab the rope to keep from sliding into the water. The groaning sounds came again, and this time, they seemed to be answering each other. Multiple voices calling across the dark water, having some kind of conversation I couldn't understand. I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself I was hallucinating from dehydration and shock. But the bumping against my raft was real enough, and so was the way my makeshift shelter rocked as massive shapes moved through the water beneath me. The ocean was full of things that weren't supposed to exist, and I was floating right in the middle of them, with nothing but some cushions and a prayer. The sun came up like a blowtorch on my second day, floating in the middle of nowhere. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, waking up every time my raft shifted or something bumped it from below. My piece of canvas had twisted during the night, leaving half my body exposed to the morning light that was already hot enough to make me squint. I did a quick damage check. One of my cushions had lost most of its air overnight, turning into a soggy pancake that barely kept me above the swells. The rope holding everything together was stretching, and I could see gaps opening between the pieces of decking. My whole setup was coming apart one knot at a time. The water bottle felt like it was mocking me. Maybe 4 ounces left, sloshing around in the bottom. I allowed myself one tiny sip and tried not to think about how my tongue already felt thick and sticky. My beacon was still flashing its useless red light. The battery indicator showed maybe 6 hours left, assuming the electronics didn't fry completely in this heat. I kept it running anyway. What else was I going to do? By 10 in the morning, I could feel my skin starting to cook. The sunscreen from yesterday was long gone, washed off when I'd jumped overboard or sweated away during the night. My face felt tight and hot, and I could see my arms turning pink despite the shade from my canvas lean-to. I tried to adjust my shelter, but moving around made the raft rock dangerously. The whole thing was held together with maybe 6 feet of rope and some very optimistic knots. Every time I shifted my weight, something creaked or slipped, and I had to grab for whatever was coming loose. Around noon, I heard helicopter rotors. The sound came from the south, getting louder fast. I scrambled for my signal mirror, nearly capsizing my raft in the process, and started flashing like crazy at where I thought the aircraft was heading. There it was, a white helicopter with Coast Guard markings, maybe 2 miles out and flying a search pattern. I waved my orange canvas over my head and kept working the mirror, sending bright flashes across the water. The helicopter turned toward me. My heart hammered as it got closer. I could see the pilot's helmet, the open door where a rescue swimmer was getting ready to jump. They'd found me. After 36 hours of floating around waiting to die, someone had actually found me. I waved both arms and shouted even though they couldn't hear me over the rotor noise. The helicopter was maybe a quarter mile away now, close enough that I could read the numbers on its side. Then it just wasn't there anymore. I blinked hard and looked again. Empty sky. No helicopter, no rotor noise, nothing but blue water stretching to the horizon, like it had never existed at all. I sat there holding my signal mirror, staring at the spot where a Coast Guard helicopter had been 30 seconds ago. My hands were shaking, and not just from the heat. "Okay," I said out loud. "That's not good." My voice sounded weird, hoarse, and cracked. When was the last time I'd spoken? Yesterday morning, maybe, when I was still on deep current and everything made sense. I took another tiny sip of water and tried to think rationally. Hallucinations were a classic symptom of dehydration. The brain started filling in gaps when it didn't have enough fluid to function properly. I'd read about it in survival manuals, but experiencing it was something else entirely. The problem was, the helicopter had seemed completely real. I could still hear the echo of rotor noise in my ears. Around 2 o'clock, the afternoon shower hit. Dark clouds rolled in from nowhere, and rain started pelting down in fat drops that felt like ice after hours of blazing sun. I cupped my hands and tried to catch water, but most of it ran through my fingers or got mixed with salt spray from the waves. I managed to collect maybe a tablespoon of fresh water. It tasted like heaven, but it was gone in one swallow and left me thirstier than before. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me soaked and shivering as the sun came back out. Steam rose from my raft, and within minutes I was baking again, my wet clothes turning into a personal sauna. That's when I heard my name. "Carol!" The voice came from somewhere off to my left, clear as day over the sound of waves against my raft. A man's voice, familiar but not quite identifiable. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just empty ocean and the glare of afternoon sun on water. "Carol! Over here!" This time it came from behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell off my raft, grabbing for the rope to steady myself. Still nothing. No boat, no swimmer, no explanation for a voice that had sounded close enough to touch. "Hello?" I called back. My voice cracked on the word. "Where are you?" Silence. Just the slap of water against my cushions and the whisper of wind across the swells. I was losing it. 2 days of sun and dehydration, and my brain was starting to manufacture its own entertainment. I knew this was happening, could recognize the symptoms, but that didn't make the voices sound any less real. I spent the rest of the afternoon patching my raft. One of the deck pieces had worked loose, and I had to retie it with a section of rope that was already doing 3 other jobs. Every knot I tied meant something else got a little looser, like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces kept changing shape. My cushion was almost completely flat now. I tried blowing air into the valve, but it leaked out as fast as I could put it in. The thing was basically a wet rag at this point, but it was still better than nothing. The sun finally started going down, painting the sky orange and red. My face felt like I'd stuck it in an oven, and I could see blisters forming on my arms where the canvas hadn't covered them. Every movement hurt, my skin tight and hot and angry. I allowed myself another sip of water. Maybe 2 ounces left now. At this rate, I'd be out completely by tomorrow afternoon. The beacon was still flashing, but the battery indicator was deep in the red zone. Maybe 2 hours left before it died completely. I thought about turning it off to save power, but for what? If rescue was coming, they needed to find me soon, or it wouldn't matter anyway. Darkness settled over the ocean, and the temperature dropped fast. I pulled my canvas around me, but it was still damp from the afternoon rain and didn't provide much warmth. My raft rose and fell with the swells, and I could hear water sloshing between the pieces where my knots weren't quite tight enough. That's when the real show started. Something huge moved beneath my raft, and the water around me began to glow. Not bright, just a soft blue-green phosphorescence that outlined shapes I couldn't quite make out. Massive forms gliding through the depths, leaving trails of light like underwater comets. I watched one of them surface maybe 50 yards away, just a glimpse of something dark and enormous breaking the water, but the bioluminescence outlined it clearly. Tentacles thick as tree trunks, a body that seemed to go on forever, and those same amber eyes I remembered from my last night on Deep Current. "You're not real," I told it. The creature sank back beneath the surface, but the glow remained, circling my raft in slow, deliberate patterns. Other shapes joined it, creating a constellation of lights in the dark water. They moved with purpose, like they were having a conversation I couldn't understand. I didn't feel scared anymore. Fear required energy I didn't have. Instead, I felt oddly calm, like I was watching a nature documentary about impossible things. My brain had apparently decided that giant glowing sea monsters were just part of the program now. "Okay," I said to the lights. "I see you. What do you want?" The groaning sound started again, rising from the depths in harmonies that made my raft vibrate. Deep, resonant calls that seemed to carry meaning, even though I couldn't understand what they were saying. I found myself talking back to them, describing my situation like I was filing a report. Sailboat destroyed by storm. Crew of 1. Adrift for approximately 40 hours. Water supplies critical. Raft integrity compromised. Rescue beacon functional but possibly outside communication range. The lights pulsed brighter, and I could swear they were listening. "I'm a marine engineer," I continued. 15 years of blue water sailing experience. I know the difference between equipment failure and... I gestured at the glowing shapes around me. "Whatever this is." One of the creatures surfaced closer to my raft, close enough that I could see details in the phosphorescent glow. Scars across its hide that looked like they came from battles with things just as large. Intelligence in those amber eyes that tracked my movements with predatory focus. But it didn't attack. It just watched, like it was waiting for something. I kept talking, partly to the creatures, and partly to keep my mind from completely unraveling. I went over my sailing experience, described the technical specifications of Deep Current. explained how GPS systems worked and why my compass had been acting up before the storm hit. Somewhere in the middle of describing magnetic declination, I realized I was also talking about things I couldn't remember seeing. Underwater cities with lights arranged in geometric patterns. Massive structures on the ocean floor that looked like they'd been built rather than grown. Ships from different eras resting in neat rows like they'd been collected and preserved. When my head cleared for a moment, I understood what was happening. My brain was trying to process trauma by creating explanations for things that didn't fit my worldview. The hallucinations weren't random. They were my mind's attempt to make sense of an encounter that had shattered everything I thought I knew about the ocean. The problem was, I couldn't tell anymore which parts were real and which parts were my brain trying to cope. The creatures in the water seemed solid enough, but so had that Coast Guard helicopter. Dawn started creeping across the sky, painting the clouds pale yellow. The bioluminescent display faded as natural light took over and the massive shapes sank back into the depths. But I could still feel them down there, watching and waiting. That's when I saw it on the horizon. Low green hills that looked impossibly close, like they'd appeared overnight. Land, maybe 2 miles away, with what looked like palm trees and white sand beaches. I blinked hard and looked again. Still there. Solid and real and close enough that I might actually be able to reach it if my raft held together long enough. I started paddling with my hands, kicking my feet to push my makeshift craft toward what might be salvation or might be another hallucination. At this point, I didn't care which. The island stayed exactly the same distance away as I worked, never getting bigger or smaller like I was swimming in place. But I kept going anyway. What else was I going to do? The waves pushed me onto a beach that shouldn't have existed. I felt sand under my face first, then rocks digging into my ribs as another wave rolled over me. My raft had finally come apart about 50 yards offshore, dumping me into water that was surprisingly shallow. I'd managed to swim the rest of the way, though swim was probably too generous a word for the desperate dog paddle that got me to shore. I lay there for maybe 10 minutes, just breathing and letting my brain catch up to the fact that I wasn't drowning anymore. The sand was real. The rocks were real. The palm trees swaying overhead were definitely real, even though they had no business growing this far north in October. When I finally sat up, I could see my island was maybe half a mile long and a couple 100 yards wide. Rocky coastline on 3 sides, with a small beach where I'd washed up and what looked like a lagoon on the far end. Dense tropical vegetation covered most of the interior, way too green and lush for anything that should exist in the middle of the Atlantic. The first thing I did was look for fresh water. My tongue felt like sandpaper, and I had maybe an hour before dehydration started shutting down my organs. I stumbled inland through knee-high grass and found a spring bubbling up from moss-covered rocks near a cluster of fruit trees. I dropped to my knees and drank until my stomach cramped. The water was cold and clean, tasting faintly of minerals but better than anything I'd ever had. I splashed it on my face and arms, washing away 3 days of salt and sun damage, then drank some more. Only after my immediate thirst was handled did I start noticing the weird stuff. There were paths, not animal trails, but actual cleared walkways winding through the vegetation. Someone had cut back the undergrowth and moved rocks to create easy passage between different parts of the island. The paths were old but maintained, like people used them regularly. I followed one toward the center of the island and found more evidence of human presence. Pieces of metal half buried in the sand, coils of rope so rotted they fell apart when I touched them, sun-bleached planks that might have been part of a boat once, scattered around what looked like an old campsite. But the really strange part was how well maintained everything seemed despite being abandoned. The fruit trees were heavy with ripe mangoes, and what looked like breadfruit. The spring ran clear and steady. Protected spots among the rocks had been arranged like shelters, with flat stones positioned as windbreaks and fire rings made from carefully stacked coral. It felt like a rest stop, a place where people had been stopping for a long time, leaving improvements for whoever came next. I spent the rest of the day exploring and setting up my own camp. I found enough driftwood to build a signal fire on the highest point of the island, using my last emergency flare to get it started. The smoke column rose straight up in the still air, visible for miles in any direction. My shelter was basic, but functional. Palm fronds woven between two large rocks, with more fronds spread on the ground for a sleeping mat. I arranged pieces of metal and wood to reflect heat from my fire, creating a warm pocket where I could sleep without freezing. As the sun went down, I made my first journal entry on a piece of cardboard I'd salvaged from somewhere. Using a pencil stub I'd found in my pocket, I wrote, Day 4, since deep current lost. Reached uncharted island approximately 32nd degree and 64 degree dive. Fresh water available, abundant fruit trees, evidence of previous castaways, signal fire established. Physical condition stable but require rescue within days. I didn't write about the kraken, not yet. I needed to process what had happened before I committed it to paper, even paper that might never be read by anyone else. That night, the groaning started again, deep resonant calls rising from the water around the island. But now I could hear the patterns in them, the way different voices answered each other across the darkness. It wasn't random noise. It was communication. Conversation between things that lived in the deep water and had intelligence enough to coordinate their activities. I crept to the edge of my camp and looked out at the lagoon. Phosphorescent trails moved through the water like underwater lightning, outlining massive shapes that glided just beneath the surface. Sometimes one would break through, showing a glimpse of tentacles or the curve of something enormous before sinking back into the depths. They knew I was here. I could feel their attention like weight on my shoulders, but they kept their distance from the island itself. Like there were rules about this place that even they respected. On my second day, I found more evidence of previous visitors. A canvas bag wedged between two rocks contained a water-stained notebook with entries in 3 different languages. The English parts were mostly illegible, but I could make out dates going back 15 years and references to the Watchers and Safe Harbor. Someone had carved initials into a palm tree, MR 2019, and below that, JK 2021. People had been getting stranded here regularly, staying long enough to leave permanent marks. I added my own entry to the notebook. CK October 2024. Sailboat destroyed by storm and sea creature. Island provides shelter and fresh water. Recommend maintaining signal fire and avoiding night swimming. The fruit was incredible. Mangoes so ripe they practically fell into my hands, breadfruit that roasted perfectly over my fire, and some kind of citrus that helped with the vitamin deficiency I could feel starting in my gums. It was like the island had been designed to keep castaways alive and healthy. By my 3rd night, I'd established a routine. Maintain the signal fire during daylight hours. Gather fruit and fresh water in the morning. Explore different parts of the island in the afternoon, looking for useful materials or clues about how to get rescued. Write in my makeshift journal each evening, documenting everything I observed. The creatures in the water had become part of the background. I could predict when they'd be most active, usually around sunset and just before dawn. They moved in patterns around the island, like they were patrolling or standing guard. Sometimes I'd see those amber eyes watching me from the lagoon, but they never came ashore. On my 4th day, I found the message tree. It was a massive palm near the center of the island, its trunk covered with carved names, dates, and brief messages, dozens of them going back decades.
Some were just initials and years, but others told stories. Storm took the Mariana, crew of 4. Only I made it. God help me. RS 1987. Third day here. Things in the water at night. Stay on land. Anonymous 1995.
Rescued by Coast Guard helicopter. Left supplies in cave near spring. Good luck. TM 2018. I found the cave TM had mentioned. Hidden behind a curtain of vines, it contained a plastic tarp, some fishing line, a rusty knife, and 3 cans of beans that were still good. Someone had been maintaining this place as a survival cache for stranded sailors. That night, I added my own message to the tree. Sea night, October 2024. Encountered large sea creature 50 miles SE of Newport. Boat destroyed. Island provides shelter but recommend immediate rescue if possible. Creatures in surrounding water appear intelligent and territorial. I carved it deep, making sure it would last. If I didn't make it off this island, maybe my message would help the next person understand what they were dealing with. The groaning sounds were getting more complex. I could distinguish individual voices now, different tones and rhythms that seemed to carry specific meanings. Sometimes they'd call and receive immediate answers. Other times there would be long pauses, like they were considering their responses. I started talking back to them. Not because I thought they'd understand, but because the silence was driving me crazy. I'd sit by my fire and describe my day, explain what I was doing to signal for rescue, tell them about my life back in Connecticut. I'm a marine engineer, I said to the phosphorescent shapes in the lagoon. I design navigation systems for boats like the one you destroyed. I've been sailing for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like you. The groaning stopped. Complete silence from the water, like they were listening. I know you're intelligent, I continued. I saw it in your eyes. You planned that attack, controlled the weather, used tactics. So what do you want? Why did you let me escape? A single long call rose from the depths, different from the others, higher pitched, almost questioning, like it was directed at me specifically. I found myself answering, I don't know why I'm here either. Maybe you wanted someone to survive, to tell the story. Maybe this island is where you bring people who interest you. More calls, overlapping now. A whole conversation happening in the water around me. Or maybe, I said, staring out at the glowing shapes, you're trying to warn me about something. The phosphorescence flared brighter, and I could see them clearly for a moment. Dozens of massive forms moving through the deep water beyond the reef. Not just the tentacled creature that had destroyed my boat, but other things. Shapes I couldn't identify. Sizes that defied belief. An entire civilization living in the depths, with this island as their designated safe zone for surface dwellers who stumbled into their territory. I wrote it all down in my journal, every detail I could remember. The attack on Deep Current, the impossible storm, the creature's obvious intelligence, and now this island that seemed designed to keep castaways alive. Someone needed to know about this, even if that someone was just the next person who washed up here. On my 5th day, I heard aircraft engines. I scrambled to my signal fire and threw on every piece of green vegetation I could find, sending up a thick column of white smoke. The sound was coming from the southeast, getting louder. I grabbed a piece of bright orange canvas I'd salvaged and started waving it over my head. But when I looked up, the sky was empty. No aircraft, no contrails, nothing but blue sky and scattered clouds. The engine noise faded away, leaving me standing on my hilltop with a smoking fire and the growing certainty that my brain was starting to crack under the strain. I'd been rescued before. I knew what helicopter rotors sounded like, what search aircraft looked like when they spotted a survivor. This had been exactly the same, right down to the way the engine note changed when the pilot adjusted course. But there was nothing there. I kept the fire burning anyway. Real or not, that sound meant rescue was possible. Someone was looking for me, even if I couldn't see them yet. That night, I wrote my most detailed entry yet. Everything about the Kraken attack, the island's impossible features, and the growing evidence that I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple maritime accident. If anyone finds this journal, I wrote, know that the Bermuda Triangle stories are real. There are things in the deep water that don't appear on any chart. They're intelligent, organized, and they've been here much longer than we have. This island seems to be neutral territory, but don't trust the water around it. And if you hear aircraft engines but can't see anything, you're not going crazy. Something is interfering with normal rescue operations. I sealed the journal in the plastic bag I'd found and hid it in the supply cave. If I got rescued, I'd come back for it. If I didn't, maybe it would help the next person. The creatures were more active that night than I'd ever seen them. The entire lagoon glowed with their movements, and the groaning calls continued until dawn, like they were having some kind of meeting, discussing what to do about their unexpected guest. I fell asleep listening to their voices and dreaming about helicopters that existed just outside the range of human vision, searching for survivors in a part of the ocean where normal rules didn't apply. The helicopter appeared as a black speck against the morning sky, growing larger as it approached from the southeast. I dropped the mango I'd been eating and scrambled up the rocky slope to my signal fire. The flames had died down to coals overnight, but I threw on every piece of green vegetation I could grab. Thick white smoke billowed up into the still air as I waved my piece of orange canvas over my head like a madwoman. "Here!" I shouted, even though they couldn't hear me over the rotor noise. "I'm here!" The helicopter circled my island twice, low enough that I could see the pilot's helmet and the Coast Guard markings on the fuselage. A crew member leaned out the open door, pointing down at me and speaking into his headset. They'd found me. After 7 days of fruit and fresh water and conversations with sea monsters, someone had actually found me. I kept waving until my arms ached, grinning so hard my sunburned face cracked. The aircraft made one more pass, then headed back toward the horizon, but this time I wasn't worried. They knew where I was now. Help was coming. 3 hours later, a white Coast Guard cutter appeared on the horizon. I watched from my hilltop as the ship approached, staying well outside the reef that surrounded my island. Smart move. The water was shallow and full of coral heads that could tear the bottom out of anything bigger than a dinghy. They'd have to send a small boat to get me. The rescue swimmers who came ashore were all business. A woman in her 30s with lieutenant's bars and a clipboard, followed by 2 enlisted men carrying medical gear and a stretcher I hoped I wouldn't need. "Carol Knight?" The lieutenant had to shout over the sound of waves breaking on the reef. "I'm Lieutenant Barker, Coast Guard Rescue Coordination. Are you injured?" "Dehydrated and sunburned, but I can walk." My voice came out as a croak. 7 days of talking to myself and sea creatures hadn't prepared me for actual conversation. "Good. Let's get you aboard and checked out properly." She gestured to one of her men. "Rodriguez, start an IV. She's been out here a week." The medic had me sitting on a rock with a needle in my arm before I could protest. The saline felt incredible, like my cells were sighing with relief as they finally got the hydration they'd been craving. "Can you tell me what happened to your vessel?" Lieutenant Barker had her pen ready, all professional efficiency. I'd been rehearsing this conversation for 3 days, ever since I'd accepted that rescue was actually possible. Keep it simple. Stick to facts they could verify. Don't mention anything that would make them think I was suffering from exposure-induced hallucinations. "Storm came up fast on my 3rd day out," I said. "Equipment started failing before the weather hit. Compass, GPS, radio, everything went haywire at once." "What was your last known position?" approximately 3215 north, 6447 west, dead center of the triangle, just like I'd planned. She wrote that down. And the storm? Came out of nowhere. Winds over 60 knots, seas building to 40 feet. My engine wouldn't start when I tried to run for it. All true, as far as it went. Boat broke up in the heavy weather. I got my life raft deployed, but it didn't last long in those conditions. How did you reach this island? Swam. Maybe half a mile from where the raft came apart. I gestured toward the lagoon. Washed up on the beach over there. Lieutenant Barker looked around at the palm trees and tropical vegetation. This location isn't on our charts. I noticed that too. But the fresh water and fruit kept me alive, so I wasn't complaining. Rodriguez finished with my IV and started checking my vital signs. Blood pressure, pulse, temperature, all the standard rescue protocols I'd read about in maritime safety manuals. His equipment beeped and hummed, recording data that would become part of my official rescue file. We'll need to do a more thorough medical evaluation once we get you aboard, Lieutenant Barker said. Dr. Simmons is standing by. The ride out to the cutter took 20 minutes in their rigid inflatable boat. I sat in the stern, watching my island shrink behind us. The palm trees and rocky coastline looked exactly like what they were. A tropical paradise that had no business existing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But as we reached the ship, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The GPS display on the rescue boat's console showed our position as open ocean. No island, no reef, no shallow water. According to their instruments, we were floating over 3,000 feet of empty blue water. I didn't say anything. What was the point? I'd been rescued from somewhere, and that was all that mattered for now. Dr. Simmons was waiting in the ship's medical bay, a competent-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands. She had me on an examination table within minutes, checking my sunburn and dehydration while asking gentle questions about my time in the water. "Any hallucinations?" she asked while examining my eyes with a small flashlight. "Visual or auditory disturbances?" "Some." I kept my voice steady. "Thought I heard aircraft a couple times when there was nothing there. That's normal with severe dehydration. Your brain tries to fill in gaps when it's not getting enough fluid." She made notes on her chart. "Anything else? Voices? Unusual sounds from the water?" I thought about the groaning calls, the phosphorescent displays, the conversations I'd had with creatures that shouldn't exist. Just the usual ocean noises. Waves, wind, that sort of thing. She nodded and gave me an injection that made my eyelids heavy. "This will help you relax for the helicopter ride to Nassau. You've been through a significant trauma, and your body needs rest." The flight to Nassau General Hospital passed in a medicated haze. I remember the steady thrum of rotor blades, the gentle rocking motion as we flew over endless blue water, and the relief of knowing I was finally safe. 3 days in the hospital gave me time to think about my story and how much of it I was willing to share. The medical staff treated me for severe sunburn, dehydration, and what they politely called exposure-related stress. Nobody asked too many questions about the details of my survival, and I didn't volunteer information they weren't ready to hear. Lieutenant Barker visited on my second day, bringing a thick folder of paperwork and more questions about my ordeal. "We've completed our search of the area where you reported your vessel was lost," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed. "No debris recovered, no oil slick, no emergency equipment, nothing. The storm was pretty intense. Everything probably sank in deep water. That's what we figured, but we also checked satellite imagery for the dates you specified." She opened her folder and showed me a series of weather photos. No storm activity recorded in that area. Conditions were reported as calm with light winds. I stared at the images. Clear skies, scattered clouds, no sign of the massive weather system that had nearly killed me. That's impossible. I was in the middle of it. Weather can be very localized in that region. Microbursts, isolated squalls. They don't always show up on satellite. Her tone was diplomatic, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The important thing is that you survived. She was right, of course. The important thing was that I was alive and heading home. But the gaps in the official record bothered me more than I wanted to admit. My insurance company was surprisingly cooperative. The adjuster who called on my third day had already processed my claim based on the Coast Guard report and the detailed equipment inventory I'd filed before departure. "We found some debris that matches your vessel description," he said over the phone. "Fiberglass fragments, pieces of rigging, part of what might have been your mast, enough to confirm total loss." "Where did you find it?" "Scattered over about 10 square miles, roughly 50 miles southeast of your last reported position, consistent with a vessel breaking up in heavy weather and drifting with the current." I didn't ask how debris from my boat had ended up 50 miles from where it actually sank. Some questions were better left unasked. Dr. Simmons discharged me on the fourth day with a clean bill of health and a prescription for sleeping pills I had no intention of taking. My mind was already too fuzzy from the trauma without adding pharmaceutical assistance. "You've been through something extraordinary," she said as I signed the discharge papers. "Don't be surprised if you experience some ongoing anxiety about returning to the water. That's a normal response to maritime trauma." "I'll keep that in mind. And if you need to talk to someone about what happened, I can recommend some excellent therapists who specialize in survival experiences." I thanked her and promised to consider it, knowing I'd never be able to explain to a therapist what had really happened out there. How do you tell someone about intelligent sea monsters and impossible islands without sounding completely insane? The flight back to Connecticut gave me 6 hours to think about my future. I had insurance money to replace Deep Current, but the thought of buying another boat made my hands shake. I had a reputation as a competent sailor and marine engineer, but that reputation depended on people believing I was rational and reliable. Most importantly, I had knowledge that nobody else possessed. I'd encountered something in the triangle that challenged everything science thought it knew about ocean life. The question was, what to do with that knowledge? As the plane descended toward Bradley International Airport, I made my decision. I would write everything down, every detail I could remember about the kraken in the island and the creatures that lived in the deep water. But I'd keep it to myself until I could figure out how to share it without destroying my credibility. The ocean had shown me wonders and terrors that existed beyond the edge of human understanding. Now I had to figure out how to live with that knowledge in a world that wasn't ready to believe it. Looking down at the Connecticut coastline as we approached the runway, I could see boats dotting the harbors and marinas where I'd spent most of my adult life. Normal people doing normal things on normal water that followed normal rules. I envied them their ignorance, but I couldn't go back to being one of them, no matter how much I wanted to. The ocean had marked me, and I was going to have to learn to live with the consequences. I stared at the insurance claim photos spread across my desk, trying to focus on hull damage and equipment failure instead of the dark water visible in the background of every shot. The Meridian had gone down in a squall off Cape Hatteras. Routine weather, experienced crew. No survivors, just another sailboat that had encountered conditions beyond its design limits, except the photos showed scorch marks on the remaining deck hardware that didn't match any known electrical failure pattern. I pushed the images aside and reached for my coffee, noting how my hand trembled slightly. 6 months since my rescue, and I still couldn't look at pictures of damaged boats without my nervous system going haywire. Dr. Simmons had warned me about ongoing anxiety, but she'd assumed it would fade with time and distance from the water. She was wrong about the distance part. I'd moved my office as far inland as possible while still maintaining my marine insurance license, but Connecticut wasn't big enough to escape the Atlantic's influence entirely. On humid days, I could smell salt in the air carried by offshore winds. Weather reports mentioned storm systems forming hundreds of miles out to sea. Even here, 50 miles from the nearest harbor, the ocean found ways to remind me it existed. My computer chimed with a new email from Hartford Marine Insurance. Another claim to investigate. Another boat that had encountered something unexpected in waters that were supposed to be predictable and safe. Subject: urgent. Multiple vessel incidents, Triangle region. I opened the message and felt my stomach drop. 3 boats in the past week, all reporting equipment failures in the same general area where I'd lost deep current. GPS malfunctions, compass deviations, radio interference. The Coast Guard was calling it a solar weather event, but the timing and location made my skin crawl. I pulled up my private files, the ones I kept encrypted on a separate drive that my employer would never see. 47 maritime incidents in the Triangle region over the past 6 months, all involving unexplained equipment failures or unusual weather conditions. I'd been tracking them obsessively, looking for patterns that might validate what had happened to me. The data was compelling if you knew what to look for. Clusters of incidents during specific lunar phases. Equipment failures that followed identical sequences. Survivor accounts that mentioned sounds from the water that didn't seem natural. But compelling wasn't the same as provable. And provable was what I needed if I ever wanted to share this information without destroying my career. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my former sailing partner. "Dinner at the wharf tonight? They have that seafood special you used to love." I typed back, "Can't make it. Work stuff." The truth was, I hadn't been to a waterfront restaurant since my return. The sound of waves against pilings made my chest tight, and the smell of salt air triggered memories I wasn't ready to process in public. Sarah had stopped asking why I'd sold my replacement boat after the 3rd time I'd canceled plans that involved being near the water. Everyone assumed I was dealing with normal trauma from losing deep current. They expected me to gradually work through my fear and return to sailing eventually. What they didn't understand was that my fear wasn't irrational. It was based on knowledge they couldn't accept. I opened the document I'd been working on for months, titled Personal Account, Maritime Incident, October 2024. 50 pages of detailed description covering everything from my departure from Newport to my rescue near Nassau, every conversation with the kraken, every impossible feature of the island, every phosphorescent display I'd witnessed in the deep water. The problem was deciding how much truth to include. The complete account read like science fiction, but sanitizing it removed all the evidence that might actually matter. I'd written 17 different versions, each one a compromise between credibility and accuracy. My latest attempt focused on the equipment failures and unusual weather patterns, mentioning possible encounters with large marine life, without specifying exactly what kind of life I'd encountered. It was cowardly, but it might actually get read by people who could investigate further. The afternoon passed slowly as I processed routine claims and tried not to think about the 3 new incidents in Triangle waters. By 5 o'clock, my office felt like a cage. I needed air that didn't smell like recycled building ventilation and coffee that had been sitting too long. I drove home through suburban Connecticut, past strip malls and housing developments that had nothing to do with the ocean. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that impossible things moved through deep water just a few hours' drive from their front doors. My house was a small colonial on a quiet street, chosen specifically because it had no view of water and no maritime history. The previous owners had been accountants who'd never owned a boat or shown any interest in sailing. It was aggressively ordinary, which was exactly what I'd needed after my rescue. But ordinary wasn't the same as peaceful. I'd installed motion sensors around the perimeter and kept emergency supplies in the basement: food, water, first aid kit, battery-powered radio. My neighbors probably thought I was preparing for hurricanes, which was close enough to the truth. I made dinner and tried to watch the news, but the weather segment included satellite imagery of the Atlantic that made my hands shake. Storm systems forming off the coast, moving in patterns that looked too organized to be natural. I switched to a cooking show instead. Around 10 o'clock, I took my laptop to the back porch and opened my encrypted files again. The 3 new triangle incidents deserved closer analysis, and I worked better at night when the suburban quiet reminded me less of the absolute silence I'd experienced on the island. The first boat had reported compass problems starting at 30°18' N north, 64°52' west, less than 5 miles from where I'd encountered the kraken. The second had lost GPS signal at almost the exact coordinates where my equipment had first started malfunctioning. The third had experienced radio interference that the crew described as rhythmic pulses, like a heartbeat. I knew those pulses. I'd heard them for 3 days before the storm hit. A dog started barking somewhere down the street. Then another joined in. Within minutes, every dog in the neighborhood was howling like they'd heard something that hurt their ears. I stepped off the porch and listened carefully, but the night air carried only suburban sounds: air conditioners, distant traffic, the hum of power lines. The dogs kept howling for almost 10 minutes before gradually settling down. I'd noticed this pattern before, always on clear nights when the wind was coming from the southeast. Something was disturbing them, something they could hear that human ears couldn't detect. I went back inside and added a note to my files. October 15th, K9 disturbance 10:47 p.m., duration 9 minutes. Wind SE 8 to 12 knots. Clear skies, no local weather activity. It was probably nothing. Dogs reacted to all kinds of stimuli that had nothing to do with sea monsters, but I'd learned to document everything, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Patterns emerged from data, and patterns might eventually lead to proof. My phone rang at 11:30, unknown number with a 401 area code, Rhode Island. Carol Knight? Yes. This is Phoenix Bowers, Newport Harbor Authority. We met before your departure last October. I remembered him. The harbor official who'd tried to warn me about conflicting weather forecasts, who'd made me promise to maintain radio contact. He'd been right to worry, though not for the reasons he'd thought. Mr. Bowers, what can I do for you? I've been following the recent incidents in Triangle waters. Equipment failures. Unusual weather patterns. The reports remind me of conditions you encountered during your passage. My grip tightened on the phone. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you do. I've been tracking maritime anomalies in that region for 15 years, and the pattern is accelerating. 3 boats this week, 7 last month. Something's happening out there, and I think you might have information that could help other sailors avoid similar problems. I was quiet for a long moment, weighing my options. Phoenix had tried to warn me before my departure. He'd recognized danger that I'd dismissed as superstition. Maybe he was someone who could handle the truth. What kind of information are you looking for? The kind that doesn't make it into official Coast Guard reports. The kind that experienced sailors know but can't prove. His voice was careful, professional. I'd like to meet with you if you're willing. Compare notes about what's really happening in Triangle waters. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Ms. Knight, 3 more boats are planning Triangle passages in the next 2 weeks. If there's something out there that poses a genuine threat to navigation, don't we have an obligation to warn them? He was right, of course. But warning people required evidence they'd believe, and evidence required sharing details that would destroy my credibility. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "That's all I ask. You have my number now. Call me when you're ready to talk." After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone. Phoenix Bowers represented a choice I'd been avoiding for 6 months. I could keep my knowledge to myself and maintain my carefully rebuilt life, or I could risk everything to warn people about dangers they weren't prepared to believe. Outside, the dog started howling again. This time, I opened my back door and stepped into the yard, listening to the night air with the attention I'd learned during my week on the island. There, just at the edge of hearing, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. The same groaning calls I'd heard in the deep water, now somehow reaching me 50 miles inland on a clear October night. The sound faded after 30 seconds, leaving only the continued howling of neighborhood dogs and the rapid beating of my own heart. I went back inside and opened my laptop, adding another entry to my files. October 15th, acoustic anomaly, 11:52 p.m., duration 30 seconds, deep frequency, similar to triangle encounters, canine response consistent with previous incidents. Then I opened a new document and started typing. "Mr. Bowers, I'm willing to meet, but you need to understand that what I experienced in Triangle waters challenges everything we think we know about ocean life. If you're not prepared to consider possibilities that exist outside conventional marine science, this conversation won't be productive for either of us." I stared at the message for 10 minutes before hitting send. Once Phoenix read it, there would be no going back to my carefully maintained normal life. But maybe normal was overrated. Maybe some knowledge was too important to keep hidden, regardless of the personal cost. The ocean had marked me, and it was time to stop pretending I could ignore what that meant.